This is Flare and Flow by TheLegandodChel on AO3. Chapter 2, Ebb. So, I'm guessing this is as much of a shock to you as it is to us, Pidge said, more like a statement than a question. They were all huddled back around the campfire, Lance finally snapping out of it enough to start bending the water off of them. Yeah. Keith still seemed in a bit of a daze, barely reacting as his hair floofed up from having the moisture pulled away. It was cute. Lance couldn't blame him for being in shock. When he had suggested they all try to unlock latent avatar powers, he hadn't actually expected anything to happen. And when he had baited Keith into joining the fun, the most he'd hoped for was to get the pretty firebender to come out of his shell a bit, not discover he was an all-powerful entity. Like he wasn't already stupidly perfect at everything anyway. It's so unfair. So, why is that? Pidge pushed her glasses up her nose. They tended to slide down when she was concentrating on a particularly interesting puzzle. The Fire Nation didn't test you? They're supposed to visit every eligible family once a new avatar is born. Keith hesitated, glancing around uncomfortably. My parents both died when I was pretty young. Lance immediately felt a pang of guilt. For all that he had been trying to get Keith to open up lately, they'd still only known each other a few weeks. This wasn't exactly the kind of conversation that could be easy to have with people who were acquaintances at best. Pidge winced, but carried on. I'm sorry to hear that. But they would have checked orphanages too. It's not unprecedented. Okay, now Keith was definitely avoiding eye contact. I didn't exactly stay in the orphanage for very long. I ran away as soon as I could and sort of took care of myself for a while. I eventually got into the Royal Firebending Academy, but he shrugged. I guess they assumed I had already taken the test. Nobody ever brought it up, and I never really thought about it. I guess that would explain it, Pidge mused. They can't exactly check every random homeless kid, no offense, so you slip through the cracks. I'm surprised they didn't keep testing people who are of the proper age, though. Well, now that we know, should we, tell somebody? Hunk asked. The Avatar's supposed to keep peace and balance in the world, so people should know he's not actually dead or missing, right? Lance turned back to Keith, only to find said Avatar had gone white as a sheet. You can't tell anyone, he blurted out, wide eyes flitting between the three of them. Why not? Pidge squinted at him suspiciously. You got something to hide? Are you a criminal or something? I thought it was weird how you never go into town with us. What? No! Keith swallowed nervously, his breathing becoming more rapid. I'm not a criminal, but there are people looking for me. Dangerous people. I have to get to Ba Sing Se and find Cheryl. I don't have time to bring balance to the world or whatever that means. Hey, calm down. Lance didn't know what Keith was talking about or who Cheryl was, but he was all too familiar with the signs of an impending panic attack. Keeping his voice low and soothing, Lance cautiously put his hand over Keith's where it had been gripping the hem of his red tunic. Keith flinched but didn't pull away, his eyes snapping to Lance's. Lance tried not to let the intensity of that stare deter him, focusing instead on the abating the worry and fear in those violet irises. It's okay, man. We'll figure it out. Lance felt the tension in Keith's grip relax slightly and gave his hand an encouraging squeeze. Look, I don't know what's going on in your life right now, but anyone would feel overwhelmed in this situation. And I know we don't know each other all that well yet, but I'd like to think that we're friends. It was a bit of a stretch. Again, they'd only met a few weeks ago, and the first 2 weeks had been mainly Lance pulling on Keith's proverbial pigtails after Keith had inadvertently snubbed him, which was admittedly not the best first impression, but once they'd gotten over that initial hiccup, Lance thought things had been going good, despite Keith's continued attempts to distance himself. Pidge and Hunk seemed to agree, judging by their faces when Keith gave them all questioning looks. We are? The furrow of Keith's eyebrows suggested uncertainty, but Lance was sure he detected a tentative hope as well. Yeah, man. Lance gave the firebender a grin, cheering internally when he got a hesitant smile in return. And friends help each other out. We can even teach you how to bend. I can help you learn water bending, and Hunk and Pidge can teach you earth and metal. At the reminder of his new powers, the furrowed brows returned. And hey, Lance scrambled to add, there's no rush, right? The Avatar's been missing for this long, and there aren't any major wars going on right now or anything, so it's not like you have to go to announce who you are to the world right this second. For now, let's just focus on learning the other elements and stuff, and we can deal with bringing balance when the time comes. Right, guys? Hunk nodded. Oh, yeah, totally. Don't sweat it, man. I mean, this is kind of a huge deal, and technically, as the Avatar, it's your responsibility to help people and settle national disputes, and Hunk! Lance jerked his head meaningfully at Keith, who was now looking even more overwhelmed than before. Hunk snapped his mouth shut with an audible click. Right, not helping. Sorry. Hunk has a point, though, Pidge said, ignoring Lance's warning glare. You will have to consider those kinds of situations in the future. But, she shrugged, it's not like you're properly equipped to deal with that stuff yet. I think Lance is right. First, you should just focus on learning the other elements. Unless a war breaks out tomorrow, you don't need to worry about saving the world yet. Thanks, that's reassuring, Keith muttered sarcastically. Hey man, we got this. Lance let go of Keith's hand so he could bend the water back out of his flask. We could even start right now. Here, I'll teach you some basic moves. Instead of sharing Lance's excitement, Keith curled in on himself, crossing his arms and hunching his shoulders. Thanks, but maybe not right now. I'm still kind of processing, and I'm not sure if I can deal with anything else today. It is getting pretty late, Pidge added. Lance pouted, but he had to admit she had a point. The sun had been setting throughout their conversation and was now almost completely below the horizon. He sadly returned the water to its container. Maybe we can try tomorrow? Keith offered shyly, glancing up through his lashes. Had he noticed Lance's disappointment, or was he just starting to come around to the idea? Either way, Lance quickly pricked back up. Sure, and don't worry. Lance sent him another over-the-top wink. I'll make you the best waterbender on the side of the North Pole. Besides me, of course. Keith rolled his eyes, but didn't try to hide his soft smile. Of course. Keith, it turned out, was a bit of a natural at learning to bend elements once he knew he could. He had always been considered a prodigy when it came to firebending. It was a big part of how he survived on the streets for years, and at the academy he had always received the highest marks in his class for both written and practical assignments. Finding out he was the Avatar was a shock, to say the least, but once he had some time to process it, Keith did what he does best, adapt to survive. Sure, this wasn't exactly what he needed on his plate right now, but it never hurt to have more weapons in his arsenal. Plus, training was actually a good distraction from his other issues. So he threw himself into learning earthbending with Hunk and Pidge. Pidge insisted Keith at least get the basics down before starting metal bending, and waterbending with Lance. Earthbending he picked up surprisingly fast, and he just knew if Shiro was here, he'd make a smart remark about Keith's hard-headedness. Earthbending is all about the jing, Hunk explained to Keith, as Pidge and Lance observed from the side. The key is to be patient and aware of your surroundings. Hunk lowered himself into a stance, limbs poised to strike. You have to hold your ground and wait for the perfect moment, and then Hunk burst into movement, slicing the air with his fist and scraping his foot across the ground in a wide arc. The dirt underneath Keith shook, causing him to lose his footing and stumble. Hunk helped him back up with a smile. Now you try. Keith took a deep breath and settled onto the correct pose. Jing. Right. Remember, Hunk added, patience is important, but you also have to be firm. Earth doesn't exactly move easily, and sometimes requires more confrontational methods. Keith's face split into a grin. Now that I can do. Waterbending was slightly more difficult. No, you have to make your movements flow more. Flow, Lance snapped, like this. I don't know what that means, Keith retorted. I'm doing exactly what you're doing. They were currently standing ankle-deep in a small stream, Lance going through basic waterbending stances, with Keith trying to mimic him. The stream itself was surrounded by lush trees that provided shade from the harsh sun, while still leaving a clear view of the azure sky. All sorts of wildflowers bloomed in large patches here and there. Keith had even spotted some adorable panda fox cubs playing nearby. It was truly a beautiful place. Too bad he wasn't really in the mood to appreciate it. Despite their current frustration, Keith had actually been getting the hang of the element pretty quickly. And not as quickly as Earth, but certainly faster than average. This particular technique, however, was eluding his grasp. He had managed to get the slip of water to weave around him in a figure-8 pattern, but unlike Lance's, which flew smoothly like glass, Keith's looked more like a jelly during an earthquake. Your movements are too harsh, Lance lectured. Water is a fluid, graceful element. You have to flow with the current. Graceful? Keith snorted. I've literally seen you trip on nothing. Ah, but was I waterbending at the time? Lance asked with a raised eyebrow and a smirk. Keith paused. I guess not. Despite this advice, Keith hadn't seen much improvement that day, or during the following few lessons. It wasn't until almost a week later that they had an unexpected breakthrough. Keith, wake up! A hand jostled Keith into sudden consciousness, and he reacted on instinct. Keith, wake up! Ah! It's just me! Keith blinked up blearily as Lance came into focus. "Why do you have that?" Lance demanded, pointing at the knife, glinting dangerously in the rising sunlight. Rubbing his eyes, Keith lowered the weapon. "Sorry." "Do you..." Lance flailed his long arms. "Do you sleep with that under your pillow? You do know you can shoot fireballs out of your hands, right? What do you need a knife for?" Not really wanting to get into his whole tragic past and abandonment issues this early in the morning, Keith merely shrugged. The group set about their daily routine, and Keith quickly forgot about the incident in the lieu of helping Hunk make breakfast, followed by practicing earthbending with Pidge. The four benders then packed up their belongings and returned to the worn travelers' roads. After making decent progress towards the Earth Kingdom's capital, they set up camp again, and Keith followed Lance to a nearby pond. However, instead of starting their usual waterbending drills, Lance turned to Keith and started fidgeting. He rubbed the back of his neck nervously, and even in the pale moonlight, Keith could see a faint blush on his cheeks. "Hey, so you know that very sharp dagger you almost killed me with this morning?" Keith quirked an eyebrow at him. "Yeah? Is it just, like, to scare people off, or do you actually know how to use it?" Any thoughts he might have had about how cute Lance's face was quickly vanished as Keith shot him an affronted scowl. "Of course I know how to use it. I'm proficient with both knives and swordplay." "Can I see?" Lance interrupted. Caught off guard, Keith merely blinked and said, okay." And so Keith found himself going through some blade exercises as Lance watched, an unusually serious look of concentration on the waterbender's face. It was actually making Keith a bit flustered, but he tried his best to ignore it. The exercises themselves were a mix of moves he learned at the academy and choreography he had created himself, transitioning smoothly from one to the next. Shiro had once said that Keith's routine resembled a dance more than a combat, and joked that Keith could always join the Ember Island players if being a soldier fell through. Once he finished the last move, Keith turned to find Lance staring at him. Keith's face, already flushed from exertion, reddened further. "What?" Keith snapped defensively. If Lance was about to make fun of his fighting technique, to his surprise, a wide grin broke out onto the waterbender's face. "That's it!" Keith frowned again, but this time it was more confusion than anything else. "What?" "The flow!" Lance excitedly grabbed Keith's shoulders, his face suddenly very close. "That was it! You just needed to transfer that into your waterbending." Okay." Keith still wasn't entirely sure what Lance was talking about, but didn't resist when Lance grabbed his hand and dragged him over to the pond. No longer distracted by the proximity of Lance's eyes, Keith was able to focus and understand what Lance meant. After an hour of practice, Keith's slip of water was just as smooth and graceful as Lance's. "See?" Lance blinded Keith with a dazzling grin. "Flow!"